My name is Gorman, and in this episode of Semilla.VC, I sat down with Robert Terenzi. He's an attorney in the Latin American group at Wilson Sonsini. While working after college at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School, he was told by his supervisors to consider living abroad. Shortly after, Robert's 6-week internship in Nicaragua turned into years of living and working in Central America and learning about the coffee trade, and later building Vega Coffee, a coffee company focused on building a supply chain that benefits coffee growing communities. In this episode of Semilla.VC, we discuss the considerations for founders when registering their international holding and domestic operating companies, how Wilson Sonsini uses fee caps and fee deferrals to help startup founders, how Robert built Vega Coffee in Nicaragua, as well as some funny stories surrounding that incredible experience. And finally, Robert's scientific analysis on the food safety of street meat vendors in Latin America and why you should just eat it. We discussed all this and more in this incredible episode of Semilla.VC. Okay, Robert, could you start by telling the audience a bit more about your work history up to and including your current role at Wilson Sonsini?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about this stuff. It's really a passion of mine, and so I'm excited to dive in. So I, coming out of undergrad, I worked at the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and I worked for Samantha Power and Michael Ignatieff as a research assistant, and I wanted to get involved in international work. And their advice to me was basically like, if you're going to get involved, you have to go live somewhere where this is relevant. And so I was supposed to go to law school in the fall. I found a 6-week internship in Nicaragua and went down there and then spent the next 2 years of my life there and put off law school, spent a little bit of time in Uganda working on microfinance. But really in Nicaragua is where I discovered the coffee supply chain and just kind of how broken it was, and spent my time there kind of working with coffee farmers and kind of trying to drive more value to the farms, and then went to law school. After that time, met my current wife, Nushin, and after law school, I went to Silicon Valley to work for Wilson Sonsini. This is like 2010, and Nushin took a Fulbright fellowship in Nicaragua. And I spent the next 3 years working with a guy named Joachim Taku, who is kind of a Silicon Valley legend. He pioneered a lot of the first open source document work for startups and continues to be a real mentor to me. After about 3.5 years of doing that, my wife and I were like, hey, let's do something crazy for a little while. And so we were going to take a year off and go back to Nicaragua to explore kind of more coffee related adventures. And that ended up turning into Vega Coffee, which is a coffee company that we started in Nicaragua with the idea of transforming the coffee supply chain to add more value to smallholding women farmers in Nicaragua. We expanded to Colombia. We raised a bunch of different rounds of finance in kind of every way you can do it, like priced rounds, safe, convertible notes, debt, working capital, grants, kind of everything you can do, revenue-based repayment, all sorts of stuff. So after about 8 years of doing that, we had 2 kids in between. We have 2 beautiful daughters, and I kind of said, one of us should probably go get a real job at some point. And so I found out about the Latin America practice group at Wilson Sonsini and started talking to the head of the group, Matt Squires, and some other people in the group, and really liked the idea of the work. And so came back to Wilson Sonsini earlier this year and have been kind of representing technology startups in Spanish-speaking Latin America, mostly because I speak Spanish, for the last 7 or 8 months.
I love it. Could you tell the audience a little bit more about what problems your team, your Latin American focused team at Wilson Sonsini, solves in Latin America for these startups?
Yeah, definitely. So, Wilson Sonsini was like the first real Silicon Valley law firm. It kind of started, I think, in the 60s or 70s, and started, and really became a giant in the region because it focused on venture finance, on technology companies from the really earliest days that it was like a capital of that sort of innovation. And so over that time period, I think that Silicon Valley has really perfected the mechanics of venture finance. It definitely hasn't perfected venture finance, given like the lack of diversity, inclusion, and investment going to minority and women founded companies. But on the technical side, it's really like a pretty smooth process, and they've seen a lot. And so what we can do is we can plug our Silicon Valley mechanics and technical expertise into emerging markets and developing startup ecosystems to make the growth of these companies like accelerate, with our kind of help. We in our group specifically, we have we'll do about 60 to 70 transactions a year. We've got, I think, over like 160 clients throughout Latin America. And so that gives us kind of like elite market awareness and perspective on what's going on in the market, what to look out for. And we also typically take the company side or the founder side on deals. And so because we've been through so many of like incorporation, a guy in a garage through going public so many times, we can help protect companies from problems before they even know that there's a threat. And so that's kind of our kind of biggest value props, I think, are kind of being a company founder friendly, really understanding what is market, what's not market, what's unreasonable by an investor, what is totally reasonable, and also just having had so many reps, like we can kind of get through a lot of the complications that might derail a somewhat less experienced kind of firm or something like that.
You mentioned the problems and threats. What are the problems and threats that are unique to an emerging market like Latin America that you might find in the US, but might be different in Latin America?
Yeah, so there's a few things. One is kind of regulatory and government interference, I would say, in the incorporation or growth cycle of a business. In the US, there's a lot you can do as a private company without incurring tax liability or without kind of provoking authorities, and that I've seen a lot more oversight in Latin America in the deals I've done, and I've seen a lot more restrictions on kind of like company flexibility and structure.
If you were king of the world, what would you change relating to Latin American laws that relate to technology startups and venture capitalists?
That one's actually pretty easy because a few years ago there was a tax reform in Mexico that has made the ability for Mexican startups to flip into a VC-friendly structure much more complicated and basically impossible without incurring a significant tax liability. And so I think that, the first thing I would do is kind of just standardize the laws, throughout Latin America with respect to incorporations and tax liability. And then specifically focusing on Mexico and kind of giving companies the ability to change their structure according to the needs of the business, which right now they are extremely limited in being able to do.
That's very interesting. So about this kind of incorporation, the holding companies, the operating companies, I think a lot of people think about the C Corps in the United States, the ETVE in Spain, or a Caribbean Cayman BVI registered holding company. What questions would you ask, or what would you tell different startups if they're thinking about navigating this process and deciding which of these countries they would register their holding company in?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of movement in this space over the last year. The market is somewhat coalescing, I would say, around the Cayman sandwich, which is popularized by Latitude, and that has the backing of Y Combinator. Andreessen Horowitz just invested in Latitude, so there's definitely a market move towards that structure, which is essentially a Cayman holding company on top, a Delaware LLC as a pass-through entity, and then you can have as many operating companies in different jurisdictions as you need as subsidiaries. The benefits to that are that it provides a lot of flexibility at exit because you can sell either the subsidiaries you can sell specific subsidiaries without incurring U.S. tax liability. You can sell the whole thing as the Cayman level, or even just the U.S. level as well. And so that has a lot of benefits. The negatives are that's pretty expensive to get set up. In the U.S., if you're just setting up a U.S. C corp, you can do that for under $1,000. And with the Cayman kind of full structure, you're looking at a lot closer to $10,000, and that can be a lot for a startup to incur at the beginning. That's one of the things that kind of some of the bigger firms like us, what we can do is provide fee deferrals and fee caps, and so that it delays some of that investment for you, but it's an expensive proposition. That said, there is still a bit of a decision tree when incorporating that one should kind of walk through to make sure that that's the right structure, essentially. Where are the company's operations and employees going to be? Where are their sales likely to be? And what does the kind of future of the company as far as investors and an exit look like? Like, where's the financing going to come from? If you're completely kind of based in Mexico and not planning on raising funds from outside fund capital or kind of any of those things, then it might make sense just to have a Mexican operating company. That said, a lot of venture capital funds, even based in Mexico, will not invest in a Mexican SAPI because of kind of the tax liability and the transparency laws that they have there. So I think that there's a fairly straightforward and safe answer in the Cayman sandwich, but it is expensive, and that can be a bit of a risk. So whenever we talk to a company, we kind of do walk through kind of the future plans of the company, what their goals are. Do they plan on entering the U.S. market? Do they plan on basically, being mostly in the U.S. after their first couple of years? Because that can eliminate the need for the Cayman top co, and we can just do kind of a Delaware C corp with a Mexican or a Mexican or Colombian, whatever it is, subsidiary underneath. So those are all kind of things to think about, basically.
I love it. You talked a little bit about your time at founding Vega Coffee in Nicaragua. Give us a whole story. Where did you live? Tell us about some of the problems. Tell us more about that whole experience, because it's kind of incredible.
Yeah, no, it's being the founder of a startup has definitely given me a different perspective on life and on fundraising and on kind of everything related to running a company and to being a lawyer of startups. There are 20 million coffee farmers around the world that live at or below the poverty line, and coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world behind oil from developing countries. And so we looked at that problem and we kind of wondered why. And our thesis was that essentially a farmer's economic relationship to coffee ends as soon as they pick the bean. That's at the first point of sale, basically, to the middlemen and coyotes up the chain. All of the value add processes in the coffee supply chain, and there are a lot of them, but the two most significant are going to be roasting and then endpoint sales. That's where 90% of the profit in the entire chain is in the last little bit of the supply chain. Farmers don't have anything to do with that. They're completely removed from that. And so what we wanted to do was change that supply chain and have all of the processing for the coffee done in coffee growing communities. So our farmers that we work with now take part in every single part of the chain, up through roasting, grinding, packaging. They even put the USPS mail label on the boxes of mail that gets sent to the US. And so through that model, we've been able to realize an increase of about 4 to 5 times more than what they were previously making through typical export channels. We have expanded to Colombia, and we work with a couple of really wonderful women-run cooperatives in Nicaragua and in Colombia. We started off as a direct-to-consumer kind of coffee of the month club, where you would subscribe and get coffee sent to you we started with like a $40,000 Kickstarter. And we've ended up growing the business significantly. And now we operate in a few different sales channels. We still have the subscription business. We sell to college and universities. We're the coffee on campus at a handful of universities on the East Coast. And we're also an ingredient in companies that are looking to use sustainably sourced ingredients in their coffee, like Daily Harvest, for example, is our biggest customer. And so it was a fascinating kind of ride. I lived in Esteli, Nicaragua. I lived with coffee farmers and in a super rural place, leaving San Francisco in the kind of the heart of Silicon Valley, working in Palo Alto, moving to Nicaragua with my wife, and kind of taking on a completely different lifestyle was really amazing. Like the hardest part about it, I think, was just kind of the logistical challenges of getting set up in a lot of ways. Like, the government there really wanted us to pay for an export license through non-legit means, and so we had to kind of protest and storm and not leave the export office until we got our license, and there were just so many steps along the way. I remember one time we were building this machine, and we needed basically horse fertilizer to add into the cement. And so I spent the day picking up horse poop. And at the end of the day, I was leaving the farm where I did that. And the guy was like, "You have to pay me for that." And I was like, "Are you kidding me? Like, this is a really crazy world that I just entered into. I'm definitely not a Silicon Valley attorney anymore." And so, it's been, from hauling, multiple suitcases full of individual coffee bags across, the border to now, filling up basically containers. It's been a real journey, and it was sad to leave. But I'm still really involved. I'm on the board, and like I said, my wife is running the business. She's doing a great job. And so I'm excited to see where it goes, but it was definitely like a unique chapter of my life, and to do it for 8 years, to survive COVID, like we have a lot to be proud of too. So I'm really pumped about it.
That is absolutely incredible. And you mentioned you sell it at colleges on the East Coast. We have to discuss after this about getting that into Georgetown. And I don't know how we can follow that story with more lawyer talk, but I think we can squeeze a couple of questions in. What is something that the average American lawyer wouldn't know about Latin America?
I think just how big and diverse the startup and VC ecosystem is. Like, when I tell people that I represent technology startups in Latin America, a lot of people are just like, "Wow, that's super niche," or "That's an oddly specific career choice." But there is so much going on, and so many different sectors that are benefiting from the growth, and I think that like doesn't get as much play. Like, everybody thinks about mega success stories in the US, like Instagram and whatever, Facebook and stuff, but you have Rappi and like a bunch of incredible Mercado Libre, Quinto Andar, like all these great big companies down in Latin America too, that are changing fundamental life on a day-to-day basis for their users. And so I think that's kind of what I would say. I don't think a lot of American lawyers understand or appreciate just how big the opportunity is in Latin America right now.
Believe me, as someone with a podcast and a newsletter about Latin American venture capital and tech, I get that sort of sentiment a lot of why are you picking that? So believe me, I'm there with you. And I think many people in the audience feel the same way. And I want to ask a question about the experience of the Latin American tech founder that it has an idea, maybe they've spoken with a lawyer, maybe they haven't, maybe they've done some Googling on what they should do. They might be, pre friends and family round or around there. What should they be thinking? Who should they be contacting? What sort of thought process should they have if they're listening to this podcast right now?
Yeah, so I think two things. One is, unfortunately, like, you kind of do have to invest early in setting your company up correctly. There's not a lot of ways around that, and it can be really costly not to do so. I think we're one of the few firms that offers things like fee caps and fee deferrals to make it more affordable for startups. Because we don't intend to make money on kind of the incorporation process. We want to develop a long-term relationship with a company and see them through growth and exit. But unfortunately, it is going to require some investment early on, and you really don't want to skimp on it or use a lawyer who is, a family friend or doesn't really know the ins and outs of venture capital. The second thing is that, Silicon Valley has Sand Hill Road, like the kind of the capital of fundraising and finance in Silicon Valley. And I haven't found a relevant kind of counterpart to that in Latin America. So what I kind of really talk about is using your networks, be active on WhatsApp chats, like attend conferences. At Vega, like we raised a lot of our money. We were kind of a little bit more in the impact space than strictly kind of high growth venture capital, but we raised a lot of the financing that we raised through attending different accelerators. Even kind of towards the later stages of the company, there were still relevant accelerators, and the connections that you make there through mentors and other companies, like I just found that to be incredibly valuable. So I think that now that COVID is like hopefully a little bit more in the rear view mirror, being in person, attending conferences, attending accelerators, really trying to grow your network and become active and involved in as many ways as you can, I think is necessary for a founder, especially a first-time founder, to find sources of capital and to find support and resources to grow their dream into a real company.
I love that. There's no Sand Hill Road in Latin America. You probably lived on a road in Nicaragua that had sand on it, so that can't compare just yet. But I want to ask, what are you most excited about right now?
Coming from kind of the supply chain and logistics background in coffee and just dealing with so many problems there, I've been really excited about a lot of the companies that we've been talking to lately who are pioneering different ways to either fix last mile distribution or international logistics. I think that those kind of efforts on supply chain and logistics are maybe not as like glamorous or sexy as like a new social media app or something like that, but media in general. But they pay such long-term benefits to not only the companies that are successful, but the entire ecosystem as a whole. Like if we can get Latin America more connected, more kind of just more like information and goods traveling within the countries and across borders, that can open up opportunities for more high growth companies to kind of experience the growth. Because sometimes you get like a criticism or a feedback about Latin America being like all the countries are so separate. There's no one big market that's big enough for us to make a huge investment in. And so I think that the more connected Latin America can be, the better the opportunities are for the startup and VC ecosystem. So I'm really excited about some of the logistics and supply chain startups that I've been working with recently.
I love it. Okay, so finally, I have to ask Peter Thiel's famous contrarian question, but with a uniquely Semilla.VC twist. What important truth about Latin America do very few people agree with you on?
So I would get yelled at about this a lot, specifically when I was living in Nicaragua. But I think street meat is good and safe at any time of the day, or more importantly at night. And I think that you should eat it all the time. I have never had a problem, and I've eaten at some really sketchy spots in Managua, and I just think I think everybody should be eating a lot more street meat. The second one, it's not that people don't agree with me on this, but I don't think enough people have really experienced the absolute bliss that is sitting on a beach in northern Nicaragua, and like Las Penitas or Chinandega, and eating like an entire fried fish with gallo pinto and like a giant watermelon juice. That is like pure heaven, and I've had so many good experiences like that. Like those are all my best days. And so yeah, I'd say just kind of get off the beaten path and eat a whole fish.
No offense to the past guests. That's the best answer I've heard for that last question. Robert, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the Semilla.VC podcast today. I very much appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I love what you're doing.
Thank you for watching this episode of Semilla.VC. My name is Trip Gorman. Don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you view the podcast. And don't forget to check out our newsletter, Dealflow LA, which can be found by going to dealflow.la.